The Battle of Culloden was the final battle of the Jacobite Rising of 1745. The Jacobites, or the Highland Scots, were attempting to restore the House of Stuart to the British throne, namely in the person of Charles Edward Stuart, the son of James Stuart, the grandson of King James II of England, also known as King James VII of Scotland. The name Jacobite comes a Latin variant of the name James, so the Jacobites were supporters of King James. However, King James was generally an unpopular king, especially as he tried to overawe the parliaments of both England and Scotland and rule by what was known as divine right of kings. The Catholic King James was then replaced by William and Mary. King William at the time was William III, Prince of Orange, a Protestant who later ruled Britain as William III. The consequence of this action is still seen today in the Protestants of Northern Ireland still identifying with the colour orange as a group of Protestants organised under the banner of the Orange Order. The Jacobites have been attempting to restore the House of Stuart to the throne for well over 50 years, there have been a number of battles and attempts at rebellion. Sometimes these were supported by Catholic France. The rebellion tended to find support in the Highlands of Scotland, part due to the clan structure of the Highlands, but also that they were generally all Catholics, and also in part that the House of Stuart was regarded as being their local king, despite Charles Stuart being born and raised in Rome and only speaking English, French and Italian. Now, in the summer of 1745, Charles Stuart landed in Scotland and started the final Jacobite rising. Earlier in that year, over in mainland Europe, the French had defeated the British and Allied army, so as a result, Charles thought this would be the perfect time to strike at a weakened British army. There were some initial good results for the Jacobites, who managed to seize the key city of Edinburgh and defeat a similar-sized army to theirs at Prestonpans. And during the battle, the inexperienced British artillerymen fled at the first sign of the charge of the Highlanders, leaving the army without artillery support. While the battle was a success for the Jacobites, it did reveal a split in the leadership of their army as to who was actually in overcharge of the battle tactics. Also led to an overestimation of the effectiveness of the Highland charge, which did work well against poorly trained troops, but later proved less effective against higher quality infantry. With the early Jacobite successes, the rebel army marched south from Scotland and into England, where they hoped that new recruits would come flooding to the banner of Charles Stuart. But other than a few hundred who formed the Manchester Regiment, new recruits were actually thin on the ground. When reached as far as Derby, things were starting to go wrong for the rebels. Expected French support in the form of troops and supplies landing by ship failed to occur, and the Duke of Cumberland, an experienced commander, was recalled from the fighting in Europe and ordered to deal with the Jacobites. So an army under Cumberland was now marching up from London, and Wade, the other army, was marching south from Newcastle. So to avoid being trapped between the two opposing armies, the Jacobite army was turned around and marched back to Scotland, where there would be fresh supplies and support. And while this retreat back to Scotland had a negative impact on the morale of the actual marchers, the whole unimpeded foray into England bolstered Charles' support in Scotland, and new Scottish recruits joined his army. In commanding the British forces against the Jacobites, Cumberland had one key advantage that he didn't have whilst he was fighting in Europe. Also, one thing the Jacobites lacked: he was in sole command of the tactical leadership of the armed forces. Now, having reached Penrith and Cumbria near the border with Scotland, he was almost in a position to deal with the Jacobites. Some skirmishes occurred with the advanced troops of Cumberland's army encountering the rear of the Jacobites. The main Jacobite army was able to move faster than Cumberland's army, part due to the size of Cumberland's army and the fact that he had 16 cannons with the army. So rather than chase after the Jacobites in winter, he camped at Aberdeen, where he could train and reorganise his troops to fight how he wanted them to fight behind this. Especially a technique with the bayonet, with soldiers, rather than attacking the person directly in front of them, attack the front and to the right. The person standing next to them in line felt safer, and the angle attack was more difficult to defend against. Charles Stuart's forces, however, weren't in quite so good position, since the Royal Navy were carrying out a blockade which prevented most of the supplies being sent from France from actually reaching the Jacobite forces. Debate amongst the Jacobite commanders came to a conclusion that they still had a very powerful army, and come the spring of 1746, they needed to inflict a defeat on Cumberland, or their army would slowly drift apart as hunger and lack of pay hit home. So when Cumberland's troops eventually left Aberdeen and marched north, generally going around the coastal areas. The Jacobite armies were determined to go over the offensive, marched out from Inverness and formed up at Culloden. The Jacobite army was outnumbered. They hoped to make use of aggressive tactics and close quarter prowess of the Highland troops to win the day. When Cumberland's army crossed the Nairn River and camped on the other side for the night, it seemed to be an ideal opportunity for some aggressive tactics. They decided upon an encircling manoeuvre and a night attack, sending off a large part of the army marching at dusk with the hopes of making a surprise attack on one wing of Cumberland's forces, a move which had worked earlier at Preston Pans. The attack had to make a large arc around Cumberland's forces, since the opposing general was well aware of the risks of such an attack and put out many sentries to guard against the attack. The night march soon descended into chaos and confusion, in part due to the hungry troops breaking up and searching for food. Eventually, the Highland troops returned back to their own lines just before dawn, once the night attack had been aborted. Returning troops were just letting down to sleep, and they were alerted to the fact that now Cumberland's rested troops were marching to attack the Jacobite army. Both armies then lined up opposing each other, getting all the regiments into good order, both armies consisting mainly of infantry units. But Cumberland had a significant advantage in cavalry, placed on one wing. Next, Cumberland started to push his artillery pieces forwards to the front. A smaller number of Jacobite cannons then opened fire, and the more effective fire of Cumberland's pieces returning fire and inflicting significant losses on the Highland troops. The advantages of the clan system meant that Jacobites could raise significant numbers of fierce hand-to-hand troops who would fight for their friends and relatives deployed alongside them. The disadvantage is that they were more difficult to organise into a trained unit or follow orders. This was compounded by the fact that each local clan chief was in charge of his own unit. As a result, the clan chief had to instruct his part of the army what to do and when to do it. This meant for an attack to be launched, each clan chief had to get orders from the commanders of the Jacobite army, and if he agreed with the order, get his troops then moving in the general direction of the enemy troops and hope for the best. So as holes were being ripped open in the dense formation of Highland troops, and the troops just clutched hold of their weapons and waiting for the order to charge. After some delay, the order to charge was given. Rather than the whole army moving as one as had been hoped for, individual units charged forward, only later to be followed by the units on either side of them. Lead units were cut down by accurate, well-drilled musket fire, supported by the cannons using canister at close range. Combined fire resulted in many of the lead Highland units never actually making contact with the enemy line. Later units that did make it in contact lacked the ferociousness of previous Highland charges. Men were tired, were hungry, many had just seen their fellows killed. In addition, the veteran troops of Cumberland's army didn't turn and run away from the charge of the Highlanders like previous armies had faced. Instead, they stood firm and pushed back the enemy. As the Jacobite army started to waver, the charge lost its energy. Cumberland then released his cavalry, waiting on the flanks, and they tore into the waving Highlanders, who turned tail and ran, creating a whole retreat in the Jacobite army. In less than an hour, the main battle of Culloden was over, but not the killing. And before the battle, Cumberland had told his troops that he captured an opposing enemy set of orders. It said that the Jacobite army were not supposed to take any prisoners. Whether this order was real or not is unknown, but given the state of the two armies, the planned night attack is possibly genuine. But the effect on Cumberland's troops meant that they now, with the battle won, had charged after retreating Highland troops and turned the retreat into a rout, slaying many soldiers who attempted to surrender. The Highlanders then made their way back to Inverness while being pursued by the cavalry. Inverness was a fairly short distance away from the battlefield, but the Jacobite reserves still held the town. The Highlanders hoped to regroup there with these reserve troops. The reserve troops were actually commanded by the Master of Lovat, who, working out what had happened in the battle, immediately switched sides. Cumberland has been described as a butcher for what happened after Culloden. It wasn't for actions at the battle and its immediate aftermath, it's instead for what came later. Even though Cumberland's troops were all fired up on the battle, there was no immediate order given to kill prisoners. Indeed, so many prisoners were taken after the battle. Cumberland opened the prisons, released all the regular prisoners in order to make room for all the Jacobite prisoners taken. Many of these Jacobite prisoners were later stand trial for high treason and subject to penal transportation. In general, it was only the leaders of the rebellion who were actually executed. Cumberland's historic standing as butcher happened after the battle during what became known as the pacification of the Highlands. The positive side of the pacification was that Parliament passed laws cracking down on the previous powers of the clan leaders. So where in earlier times they were laws unto themselves, acting as judge, jury and executioner in their own little area, now they had to follow the same laws as everybody else. This basically broke the powers of the clans and prevented another Highland rising happening. However, Cumberland also sent his troops to hunt down all the rebels, something the troops carried out with great enthusiasm. Even those suspected of being rebels or harbouring rebels were hunted down. Settlements were burned and cattle were seized. Over 100 people were hanged. Many more people died while awaiting trial. The brutality of this action, well after the battle was over, gave Cumberland the name of the Butcher.